And there's the Ospreys. It's always good to have them, and we are so happy to see them coming back. You know, they usually come back to Mystery Island here about the 10th or 11th of March, but they didn't show up until, just a few days ago, and still don't see too many of them, but at least they got their little chorus together to sing for us this morning. And welcome once again to McDuff Lives. I'm John O'Loughlin. And things are going great. Had a couple doctor appointments yesterday. Everything's fine. Everything's coming along with the wrist. I apologize for my Substack readers because I haven't been able to type much, but I will be back at it very soon, having some really good physical therapy. And so everything's great. And I hope everything's great with you. Thanks for watching me, whether you're on my Rumble channel at McDuff Lives, all one word, which is my flagship channel right now. And if you are not there, please go there and follow me there, even if you prefer to watch me somewhere else like YouTube, because YouTube, I can't rely on them. There's often a show that I have to take down just because I said some word or something. So that's why I really do appreciate the folks that have joined me on Rumble. And you can always see my archive at my BitChute. It's called McDuff Uncensored on BitChute. And it's uncensored, so that means you get to see all of my comments about, you know what. Well, today I want to venture back into some of the great books by Doug Valentine. As you know, I read his book, The Phoenix Program, way early on in my broadcasting. And unfortunately, it's one of the readings that got taken down by YouTube, so I no longer have a copy of it. But you can get a copy of it from Amazon. Doug Valentine is one of the most important historians of our time, and he's written not only about the Phoenix Program, but a lot about organized crime. And I was reviewing his book, The Strength of the Wolf, The Secret History of America's War on Drugs, recently with my friend George Webb, who sent me a note saying, let's do a show on Strength of the Wolf. And I say, absolutely, because a lot of what Doug has uncovered in that book is very, very relevant to today. And I'll just mention the amount of work that George Webb has done on LSD and the use of that as a way to entrap people. It goes way back, and Doug has documented it back into the very early 50s with the CIA. So, but that's part of the book I'm not going to read today. The part I'm going to read is chapter 17, because the politics and the misunderstandings and the personalities that are shown in this particular chapter of the book are very relevant in trying to understand what's the real story behind the assassination of John F. Kennedy. As I said, it shows you the very fertile ground for something horrible to happen, and so that's why I want you to just listen. I'm going to read mostly. I'm going to start with a couple of introductions of people that are introduced earlier in the book. The first one, of course, is Harry Anslinger. You know him from the Reefer Madness movie and his reputation as the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. The next one I would mention is Charles Siragusa. I'll just read the short bio that Doug Valentine provides at the beginning of his book, The Strength of the Wolf. Siragusa, Charles, joined the FBN before the Second World War, protege of George White, and I'll mention him in a moment, served in the OSS, group leader in New York, opened the FBN's first overseas office in Rome in 1951, became the FBN's liaison to the CIA in 1959 when he returned to Washington as a field supervisor, competed with Giordano to replace Anslinger as commissioner, and retired in December of 1963, right a month after the event. White is just George H. White is one of the most notorious people in history in my book. George H. White, perhaps the FBN's most flamboyant and controversial character, his claim to fame was making the 1937 Hip Sing Tong case, joined the OSS in 1942, and worked with James Angleton in counterintelligence. Hello. Also worked on OSS truth drug operations. After the war, served as district supervisor in Chicago, Detroit, and San Francisco. In 1951, he hoped to become New York's district supervisor, but the job went to James Ryan. So he took a contract with the CIA and managed its MK Ultra safe house in New York until 1954, became the FBN's supervisor at large. In 1955, became district supervisor in San Francisco, where he ran 3 CIA safe houses until his retirement in 1965. And those safe houses, of course, are quite famous as the Brownstone operation. I'm just going to read the bio, short bio of Angleton. Angleton, James J., worked with George White and Charlie Siragusa in the OSS, was chief of counterintelligence at the CIA, and in that capacity was the CIA's liaison to FBN agents Charlie Siragusa and Hank Manfredi, was also in touch with the mafia through labor lawyer Mario Brode and through his staff with the Israeli intelligence service, the Mossad. Okay. See what I mean? It's quite a mix, and the text that follows is just really well, it's put together like a real historian. I just love to read Doug Valentine's work. Okay, page 259, chapter 17, The Strength of the Wolf. Aggravating Edgar, Bobby Kennedy and the FBN. A little quote from Shakespeare's Hamlet. What to ourselves in passion we propose, the passion ending, doth the purpose lose. For 32 years, Harry Anslinger suffered J. Edgar Hoover's insults and interference and did nothing in response. Anslinger submissively accepted the fact that Hoover was a more powerful bureaucrat with 10 times as many agents, a vastly bigger budget, a broader mandate, and secret files he'd been compiling since his salad days as a special assistant on subversive matters to Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. It is said that Hoover brought along these files when he became the FBI's assistant director in 1921, that he continually expanded them after he became FBI director in 1924, and that he used them to compile dossiers full of dirty little secrets on America's top politicians during a reign of intimidation that lasted 46 years and spanned the incumbency of 8 presidents. Knowing he was outgunned, Anslinger refrained from directly challenging Hoover, but a rivalry simmered between them, and for years Hoover kept Anslinger on the defensive by making snide comments about the corrupting influences of undercover narcotics work. Plus which, the publicity-conscious FBI director grabbed all the glory by having his agents choose celebrity public enemies, like John Dillinger, at the expense of mounting arduous investigations of organized crime. Anslinger, however, had Andrew Mellon and several other establishment heavyweights in his corner, and he could not be dismissed. He wasn't intimidated by Hoover's bluster and prominence, and he continued about his business. In public, he behaved properly, as if he respected the despicable little man. Behind the scenes, the personal animosity between the 2 bureaucratic warlords began in 1932, during the Charles Lindbergh kidnapping case. Anslinger's mentor and friend, Elmer Eyre, chief of the IRS intelligence unit, played a decisive role in the investigation by having marked bills passed to Richard Hauptmann, the alleged kidnapper. That measure, which was standard operating procedure for FBN agents, led to Hauptmann's capture and conviction. Lindbergh was grateful, but Hoover was incensed. Fearing that Irie would solve the case, Hoover initially tried to have him removed from it, but Lindbergh objected and prevailed, so Hoover put Irie under FBI surveillance in a brazen attempt to steal his investigative leads. Despite Hoover's juvenile attempts to preempt him, Irie single-handedly solved the case, and Lindbergh publicly credited him for doing so. But the indignity of having been upstaged prompted Hoover to open one of his secret files on Irie, and for years afterward, Irie routinely checked his telephone for FBI taps. This episode taught Anslinger a valuable lesson about the petty FBI director's unforgiving and abusive nature and the advantages of staying out of his line of fire. Hoover's fad for chasing down, quote, most wanted, unquote, criminals subsided with the Depression, and Anslinger's prestige grew during the Second World War, but Hoover's power grew even greater. While many of Anslinger's agents joined the armed services and his workforce diminished, President Roosevelt increased the number of FBI agents fivefold and gave Hoover carte blanche to bug and wiretap anyone in the name of national security. The FBI was also made responsible for intelligence operations in the Western Hemisphere, and Hoover spread 150 Special Intelligence Service agents throughout Latin America and Canada. The FBI director also entered into an exclusive liaison relationship with William Stevenson, chief of Great Britain's intelligence operations in the Western Hemisphere. Well, I just stop and say that's pretty significant right there, is that J. Edgar Hoover partners up with William Stevenson. And how smart was that, really? Well, Hoover was somebody that wanted to ingratiate people he saw as superior or more powerful, and certainly a connection like the British Secret Service sounded like somebody he'd want to be with. So in comes Great Britain into the FBI. Hoover savored his exclusive relationship with Stevenson while it lasted, but then in 1942, President Roosevelt put William Donovan in charge of the OSS. The British welcomed Donovan and his OSS forces, which started fighting behind enemy lines in Europe. And Wild Bill cheerfully crashed what J. Edgar thought was going to be a private party with Bill Stevenson. That hurt socially and professionally. But when Donovan's OSS agents started mounting counterintelligence operations in the U.S., in one instance breaking into the Spanish embassy, Hoover retaliated in every way possible. Having formed a fast personal friendship with Donovan and having sent several of his best men into the OSS, Anslinger again found himself allied with one of Hoover's most hated rivals. Still steaming after the war, Hoover opposed Donovan's efforts to form the Central Intelligence Agency. He repeated a claim he had made about the OSS and said that the CIA was hiring communists. But the agency was created over Hoover's protests, and when President Truman decided that the new spy agency should absorb the FBI's operations in the Western Hemisphere, Hoover vindictively ordered his agents not to share their files or sources with the CIA, with whom Anslinger had also aligned. The new wave of anti-communist witch hunts instigated in 1950 by Senator Joe McCarthy restored Hoover's confidence and sense of purpose, and during the ensuing Cold War, his powers peaked. FBI agents were exempted from civil service rules and, under the aegis of national security, were allowed to conduct burglaries and all types of illegal surveillance. With eyes and ears in bedrooms all over Washington, Hoover packed his files full of sexy secrets that he traded to beholden politicians for power. Then in 1956, he unveiled his most awesome weapon ever, the notorious counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO. which allowed FBI agents to commit any crime imaginable in order to suppress civil rights and leftist groups that threatened national security. COINTELPRO enabled him to shape the political climate in America, and his bulging secret files prompted Senator Estes Kefauver to declare that Hoover had, quote, more power than the president, unquote. That may have been true, but Anslinger wasn't afraid, and he even eventually forced a showdown with Hoover over the mafia. As we know, Hoover denied its existence, and his disingenuous position on this issue had a cumulative negative effect on federal drug law enforcement. So, in his last year as commissioner of the Bureau of Narcotics, Anslinger unleashed his frustration and fury. In a 1962 interview, he said that he had refused to give a copy of the Mafia book to Hoover because, quote, he just wouldn't risk it, unquote. Anslinger insinuated that Hoover had been corrupted by organized crime. And it was true. Hoover's friend, columnist Walter Winchell, socialized with Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello and served as an intermediary between the famous influential gangsters and the starstruck FBI director. Hoover and Costello actually met on occasion, and investigative journalist Anthony Summers, citing several sources, reports that Lansky acquired from Donovan and the OSS photographs of Hoover engaged in a homosexual act, and that those pictures put him in the mob's pocket forever. Not only was Hoover a closet queen, he was a degenerate gambler, too. He liked to bet on the ponies, and in exchange for free passes and hot tips, he repaid his underworld patrons by insisting that racetrack gambling was not a federal crime. He pretended not to know that Lansky and Costello controlled the off-track bookie business, or that it was one of organized crime's biggest sources of revenue. Anslinger's standing with Hoover did not improve during the Kefauver hearings, which, with the FBI's expert assistance, forced Costello into early retirement and Lansky into exile. But Hoover quickly found a new patron in Texas oil tycoon Clint Murchison. And starting in 1953, Hoover and his housemate, FBI executive Clyde Tolson, became Murchison's annual guests at the Del Mar racetrack in California. The oil band's ties to organized crime were not as close as Costello's, but they were there. According to Summers, quote, 20% of the Murchison Oil Lease Company was owned by the Vito Genovese crime family. Wow. Handridge Oil, a Murchison-owned outfit, was the subject of a deal with Las Vegas gamblers involving massive security violations. There was also to be deals with Jimmy Hoffa, the crooked boss of the Teamsters Union, and Clint Jr. established financial ties with mafia boss Carlos Marcello. Hoover's defenders say he had bigger fish to fry and that he let Anslinger and the IRS chase the gangsters while his G-men pursued communists, civil rights leaders, and other menaces to national security. But the man had a secret agenda, and as the establishment's private police force, the FBI served its patrons by allowing organized crime to subvert the labor and civil rights movements from within. If the hoods moved drugs in their spare time, who cared? Like the mafia bosses said, as long as the poison ended up in ghettos and not in good neighborhoods. Anslinger and Hoover obviously agreed on the racial issue, but the FBI director's protection of organized crime undermined Anslinger's mission and his legacy. So he waited, and in a veiled attack on Hoover, he said in 1964, quote, sometimes our strongest foes can be found in the chambers of justice, the state houses, and even higher. Pardon me? All right, here comes Bobby Kennedy. Enter Bobby Kennedy. Anslinger waited until he was on the verge of retirement to attack his old foe, but he never would have had the opportunity if not for the November 1960 election of John F. Kennedy as president and his appointment of his brother Bobby as Attorney General. Ambitious, ruthless, and cunning, Bobby wasn't content to behave in the traditional role of the president's consigliere, and he used his authority as Attorney General to sidestep Hoover. Declaring war against organized crime, he increased the number of attorneys in the Justice Department's criminal division from 15 to 60 and directed them against the nation's leading racketeers. Bobby had a mean streak, too. In order to make his presence felt, he openly inquired how a behemoth like organized crime could escape the attention of the FBI's director. He further bruised Hoover's gigantic ego by praising the FBN for putting more mafia bosses behind bars than the FBI, and, according to George Gaffney, by dubbing it, quote, the Marine Corps of Federal Law Enforcement, unquote. Figuratively speaking, this insolent behavior was a death sentence for both Bobby Kennedy and the FBN. Hoover was so angry that he sent a letter to Anslinger calling the Genovese case a frame-up and a travesty of justice. Heedless of having made an enemy of J. Edna, as he privately referred to the lavender-scented FBI director, Bobby formed a special group in the Justice Department to pursue Jimmy Hoffa and Hoffa's closest mafia associates, Santo Trafficante, Sam Giancana, and Carlos Marcello, all of whom shared Hoover's hatred of the overly aggressive AG. But Bobby was looking for a fight, and his first reckless act as Attorney General was to deport Marcello to Guatemala in April 1961. As a pretext, Bobby claimed that Marcello was an undesirable alien, based on the fact that the FBN had busted him in 1938 for selling 23 pounds of marijuana. The undesirable alien act comes up more recently, does it not? It's interesting to reflect back here with Bobby asserting it. Undesirable alien. With this fateful action, Kennedy pushed his criminal and government enemies into an alliance. And 6 weeks after the Bay of Pigs fiasco, Marcello slipped back into America and, with equally furious anti-Kennedy factions in the FBI, CIA, Mafia, and Cuban exile community, began plotting revenge. Pardon me once again. $1 Million Men. While serving as chief counsel on Senator John McClellan's Select Committee on Improper Activities in Labor and Management, Bobby Kennedy learned how drug smuggling factored into the mafia's relationship with the Teamsters. He was present in July 1959 when FBN agent Ike Worms explained to the committee how Teamsters official Abe Gordon laundered drug profits through a union welfare fund. Bobby learned that Carlo Gambino was involved with the Teamsters through his labor consulting firm in Manhattan, and that Jimmy Hoffa had protected Detroit's major drug traffickers, John Prizziola and Raffaele Quasarano, by assigning them to Teamsters Local 985. He knew that Trafficante and Marcello were associated with Hoffa, that Marcello influenced the Teamsters and longshoremen's unions in Louisiana, and that Trafficante had an office and a Teamsters local in Miami, which had been established by mafia drug traffickers James Plumeri and Frank DioGuardia. Kennedy knew that Marcello's representative in Dallas, Joe Civello, had attended the Appalachian Conference on Marcello's behalf, and he suspected that Marcello, through Trafficante in Florida and Sam Carolla and Frank Coppola in Sicily, played a dominant role in international drug trafficking. As Bobby was certainly aware, the FBI office in New Orleans believed that Marcello received narcotics from Trafficante in Florida on Teamsters trucks, and that his Pelican Tomato Company, which supplied naval bases in Louisiana, smuggled drugs from Mexico, quote, without interference from customs, unquote. Kennedy wanted to nail Trafficante and Marcello, but the FBI had only 4 agents in its Miami and New Orleans office, and the FBI, though it had the manpower, chose not to place wiretaps on them. These 2 were the only mafiosi to receive such privileged treatment from J. Edgar Hoover. The FBI agent in charge in New Orleans, Regis Kennedy, even made the outrageous claim that Marcello was not involved in crime. So Bobby took matters in hand. INS officials arrested Marcello on a street in New Orleans, placed him in handcuffs, drove him to an airport, put him on an airplane, and whisked him off to Guatemala, which he had identified on a falsified birth certificate as the land of his birth, without so much as a toothbrush. Marcello, however, had friends in high places in Central America, and in addition to receiving a free pass from the FBI, he probably enjoyed CIA protection. They certainly shared the same unsavory business partners. Marcello ran a counterfeiting scam in Nicaragua that required kickbacks to Anastasio Somoza, the brutal dictator who, on behalf of the CIA, harbored anti-Castro terrorists on one of his private estates. As we know for a fact, the CIA sometimes employed gangsters for its nefarious purposes, and the agency probably arranged for Marcello's flight to Miami aboard a Dominican Air Force jet, quote, without either customs or immigration officials noting his arrival, unquote. Considering that his re-entry occurred prior to Trafficante's exposure as a double agent, it's also likely that, in return for the favor, Marcello joined William Harvey's ZR/Rifle project as a recruiter of assassins. Of course, the William Harvey and the ZR Rifle project are all associated with JM Wave, and wow. So you see how organized crime becomes a huge factor in what happens to John F. Kennedy. And the rivalry, this intense hatred of Hoover and Bobby explodes. By 1960, the CIA was protecting Joe Bonanno for the same murderous reason. Having moved to sunny Tucson, Arizona, and started a legitimate real estate company, he also formed a profitable regional alliance with his fellow racketeers, Santo Trafficante and Carlos Marcello. Like his newfound friends, he bought protection from the CIA, too. According to investigative reporter Seymour Hersh, during the winter of 1960 to 1961, Bonanno was, quote, always calling, unquote, William Harvey's boss. You want to guess who it is? Richard Bissell. On an outside line. He even wrote a letter offering to do what Bissell, quote, wanted him to do, unquote. In other words, having people killed. Bissell accepted the offer, and Bonanno's caporegime in New Jersey, Joseph Ciccarelli, that's Zicarelli, Ciccarelli, provided the services. With the assistance of CIA asset Robert Mayhew, Ciccarelli sold guns to Rafael Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, and Ciccarelli's goon squad reportedly murdered one of Trujillo's political opponents in New York. Ciccarelli's henchmen may even have switched alliances and served as the intermediaries in the 30th of May 1961 assassination of Trujillo, which relied on guns that were provided to the victim's political opponents by the CIA as part of Harvey's ZR/Rifle program. Ciccarelli enjoyed political protection locally through his congressman, Cornelius E. Gallagher, but it was his dirty work for the CIA that made him a $1 million man. as mobsters with the CIA or FBI protection are called, and granted him temporary immunity from prosecution on federal narcotics charges. This was an unfortunate development for the FBN insofar as Ciccarelli had replaced the recently incarcerated Carmen Galante as the Bonanno family's narcotics manager. Ciccarelli was a suspect in the Cotroni and Rinaldo cases, and through a wiretap on a gun store owner in New Jersey, the FBN knew that he had attempted to purchase 1,000 rifles for anti-Castro exiles in the CIA's employ. But Ciccarelli, like Marcello and Trafficante, was light years beyond the FBN's reach. That's $1 million man. I guess today you'd have to call him a billion or $1 trillion man. Bobby Kennedy's mortal foes. Bobby Kennedy, like Harry Anslinger, could not be bought. He was a rich man bent on destroying organized crime's corrupting influence on American society. And yet, just a few months after he had taunted Sam Giancana during televised hearings before the McClellan Committee, parentheses, he said to Giancana giggled like a girl, his father, on 29th of February 1960, met with Giancana at a restaurant in New York. Joseph Kennedy was there with Giancana, Johnny Roselli, and Mario Brode, who is James Angleton's link to the mafia, to negotiate the terms by which the mafia's constituents in Illinois would vote for JFK in the upcoming presidential election. The Hoods were trying to decide whether to support JFK or Texas Senator Lyndon B. Johnson, who was backed by Carlos Marcello, through Joe Civello in his bid for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. Family patriarch Joe Kennedy argued that Giancana's organization would fare better under a Kennedy administration, which had many financial holdings in Chicago, and he asked the Hoods to contribute $500,000 to JFK's campaign. For practical business reasons, the money was forthcoming, despite Giancana's hatred of Bobby. Then the inexplicable happened. Sometime in October 1960, while plotting with the CIA to murder Castro, Giancana came to suspect that comedian Dan Rowan was putting the moves on his girlfriend Phyllis McGuire. Rather than use his considerable muscle to resolve the matter privately, Giancana asked CIA asset Robert Mayhew for help, and Mayhew, breaching CIA security, sent an employee to spy on Rowan in Las Vegas. In another departure from standard security practices, Mayhew's private detective left his listening post in the room next to Rowan's, ostensibly to watch a Vegas floor show, and while he was gone, a chambermaid found his tape recorder running. She called the hotel manager, who called the police. They called the FBI. The FBI eventually called the CIA, and the case was buried 18 months later when CIA General Counsel Lawrence Houston explained to Herbert Miller, the Assistant Attorney General in charge of the Justice Department's Criminal Division, that the agency had employed Giancana in its assassination plots, and that prosecuting him would harm, guess what? National security. What's important about this botched bugging incident, assuming that it wasn't intentional, and that Bobby Kennedy had no knowledge of his father's meeting with the mob, is that Bobby didn't know that Giancana was $1 million man until April 1962, when Hoover finally told him about Giancana's role in the CIA's assassination plots. Hoover had known since October 1960 about the role the Chicago Hood played in the CIA's plans to kill Fidel Castro, and his long delay in notifying Kennedy was a clear indication of his hostile intentions, as well as his partisan political support for Richard Nixon. Giancana had exposed his CIA connection simply as an insurance policy, but Mayhew, like Hoover, had assisted him on behalf of Nixon. The future president had been party to the Castro assassination plots from their inception during the Eisenhower administration, and Mayhew, at the time of the Vegas bugging blunder, was handling public relations for billionaire Howard Hughes, one of Nixon's biggest financial backers. The CIA and FBI had one thing in common. Neither was anxious to help Bobby Kennedy. And it wasn't until the 7th of May, 1962, that the CIA finally told Bobby about its Cuban escapades. And even then, CIA Security Chief Sheffield Edwards and General Counsel Lawrence Houston lied. They said their assassination attempts had ended with Trafficante's exposure as a double agent, and they promised to warn Bobby if they ever dealt with gangsters again. The smirking CIA officers then slinked away, knowing full well that Mayhew had introduced Johnny Roselli to the CIA assassination chief Bill Harvey on April 8, 1962, without the Attorney General's knowledge, and that Harvey had delivered poison pills and weapons to Manuel Verona, the anti-Castro politician Trafficante had brought in to assist in the conspiracy. Quote, the Attorney General was not told that the gambling syndicate operation had already been reactivated, nor, as far as we know, was he ever told, unquote, the CIA casually admitted in an Inspector General's report dated 1967. In yet another telling sin of omission, James Angleton, who deeply resented Bobby's interference in CIA counterintelligence operations, would neglect to tell Bobby about Mario Brode, his liaison to Sam Giancana and Johnny Roselli until 1963. Yet another $1 million man, Roselli, was assisting Hoover as well as the CIA in the conspiracy to sabotage Bobby Kennedy. Through an FBI wiretap on Roselli, Hoover was aware of some 70 phone calls between Jack Kennedy and pretty Judith Campbell, a mob courier in the mold of Virginia Hill, but without Hill's stature. Roselli had introduced Kennedy and Campbell at a swinging Frank Sinatra campaign party in Vegas, while Campbell was romantically involved with Sam Giancana, parentheses, who experienced no irrational fits of jealousy this time, unquote. Close parentheses. Suffering from terminal satyriasis. Satyriasis. The disease of being being a satyr, I guess, being a satyr who cannot stop being a satyr. Kennedy continued to see Campbell until March 22, 1962, when Hoover confronted him with his indiscretion. At this meeting, he also let the president know that he was aware of the deal that Mario Brode, on behalf of James Angleton, had brokered between Giancana and Joe Kennedy. That just takes my breath away, the father doesn't tell the son is spying on unbelievable. Hoover tried to blackmail him. Of course, that's why he told Jack about Judith Campbell, right? Guess what? I got something on you. But Jack Kennedy wasn't intimidated, and after the revelation that top CIA officers had encouraged ultra generals in Algeria to mutiny against French President Charles de Gaulle, he stunned the establishment by firing the popular and much admired Allen Dulles. At which point, the most powerful people in the CIA and the military started skirting the White House, leaving Jack and Bobby to defend themselves. Bobby Kennedy's assassination plots. While CIA assassinations were flourishing under Bill Harvey's ZR rifle program, Bobby Kennedy launched 3 of his own mafia-related plots to kill Fidel Castro. The first, incredibly, involved drug smuggler Norman Rothman. As Rothman reported to his FBI masters on June 26, 1961, Bobby's aides had invited him to the White House a few days earlier and had offered him leniency in a gun-running case, parentheses, in which he was caught smuggling arms to Castro with former Cuban President Carlos Prios Socarras, close parentheses. 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 if he would arrange to kill Castro. Rothman said he refused, and maybe he did, but the point is that his information certainly made a beeline to Hoover. Supplying the devious FBI director was yet another dirty little secret to use against his nemesis. Putting Hoover's petty intrigues to one side, we should ask when, if ever, the FBI learned that the Attorney General was offering a major drug smuggler immunity to commit a political assassination, and how much the Bureau might have known. If anyone was in a position to know, it was Charlie Siragusa. Bobby's approach to Rothman occurred 5 days after Siragusa had denounced Santo Trafficante as a double agent. That vital piece of information undoubtedly reached Bobby immediately in view of his deep personal involvement in Cuban affairs. Siragusa may have delivered the message himself. At the time, July 1961, he was working closely with Bobby in an effort to ransom David Christ, a CIA officer who'd been captured in Cuba while trying to bug the Chinese news agency. He was also managing the MK Ultra pad in New York, and he'd been asked to help the CIA recruit gangsters for its political assassination plots. Charlie was involved in almost every important counterintelligence activity, so it's very likely that Kennedy or one of his aides consulted him about Rothman. The nature of Siragusa's relationship with Bobby Kennedy raises several questions about the thrust of federal drug enforcement. Specifically, is it conceivable that Siragusa did not tell Bobby about Rothman's long-standing association with Meyer Lansky, financier of international drug smuggling, or that Rothman co-owned the El Morocco Club in Havana with Corsican drug lord Paul Mondoloni, or that Mondoloni had been selling 50 to 150 kilos of heroin every few months to Rothman and Trafficante since 1955, or that Rothman had invested with Genovese family member Charles Turina in Havana's Capri Casino, and that Giuseppe Di Giorgio, a card dealer at the Capri, was one of Trafficante's two major narcotics couriers and an associate of Salmonieri from the Rinaldo Palmieri case. How could Siragusa not make these connections known to the Attorney General, especially when Bobby had, at the time, aimed his first drug strike force at the defendants in the Rinaldo Palmieri case? In the years since Rinaldo and Palmieri were busted, Siragusa had been closely tracking Lansky, Trafficante, Mondoloni, and Rothman, four men at the top of the international drug trafficking conspiracy. He knew that Mondoloni had been in Havana in January 1960 and had met in Acapulco in April 1960 with drug smugglers Lucien Rivard, Marius Cowell, and Rosario Mancino. He was aware that Mancino was the Sicilian supplier of the ill-fated Albert Aguechi in Canada. Did he tell Bobby about this aspect of the Rinaldo Palmieri case? Did he seize the opportunity to pump Rothman for information about these interrelationships? Or was Rothman the ultimate million-dollar man? Remember, he would avoid imprisonment with Pepe Cotroni and Pittsburgh mafioso Sal Manarino, whose brother Gabriel was Trafficante's partner in Havana's Sanssouci casino, for attempting to sell $8.5 million worth of stolen securities. The reason, as explained in Chapter 12, was that Rothman had used the money to ship guns to Cuba in what was obviously a CIA-sponsored criminal conspiracy. Rothman was never investigated for drug smuggling either. By the summer of 1961, Castro had closed the last of Cuba's casinos, and the international drug lords were making new political arrangements in Mexico, Canada, and elsewhere. Rothman was privy to their plans and could have explained their intentions. If Siragusa did not corner Rothman in this regard so that Bobby Kennedy could proceed in his assassination plots, then he had abandoned his personal commitment to drug law enforcement and had condemned the FBI to failure at the exact same time Lee Spear was conducting his integrity investigations in New York. On the other hand, if given the chance, Siragusa did tell Bobby the facts, then it was the Attorney General who chose to abandon his war on crime, simply for a chance to kill Castro. This seems to be the case insofar as Bobby launched a second assassination project in early 1962 using CIA officer Charles Ford, a veteran of the Far East Asia Division, to contact mafia bosses in America and Canada for the sole purpose of finding someone to kill the Cuban Prime Minister. Bobby's third mafia-related assassination plot, Operation Mongoose, was activated in March 1962. Managed by the National Security Council's special group under the direction of General Edward Lansdale, Mongoose included William Harvey's ZR rifle unit, now dubbed Task Force W. In league with Harvey, Lansdale conjured up 33 often bizarre ways of destabilizing the Castro regime, including the introduction of cheap marijuana into Cuba and falsely accusing Cuba of drug trafficking. There were plans to assassinate Castro, too, and in one remarkably explicit memo to his staff, Lansdale suggested that, quote, gangster elements might prove the best recruitment potential for actions, i.e. murders, against police intelligence officials. Lansdale added that chemical warfare agents should be fully considered, quote unquote. One can only imagine which mafia hitmen Charles Ford recruited and the crimes they, Lansdale, and the CIA committed in Cuba with the blessings of Bobby Kennedy, all to the detriment of the FBN and the American public. The intelligence angle. While Bobby Kennedy was using mafia drug smugglers in murder plots against Castro and thus neutralizing the FBN, the CIA was relocating its Havana station and anti-Castro terror activities to Miami. Known as JM Wave, the station was managed by Theodore Shackley, a protege of Bill Harvey from Germany. It included Lansdale's Mongoose unit and some 400 CIA case officers. Already the preferred habitat of America's mobsters, Miami was soon packed with dozens of CIA front companies, thousands of CIA informers and assets, and several drug smuggling terror teams financed by wacky privateers like William Pauley, mentioned in Chapter 5 as having engineered the Pauley Cook Advisory Mission in Taiwan in 1950. To cover a fraction of the cost of this massive enterprise, former OSS spy master Paul L. E. Hallowell established and directed a string of drug money laundering banks for the CIA. At the time, Hallowell was general counsel for the Thai consulate in Miami, an active leader in Florida's Republican Party, and friend of Nixon's cohort, Bebe Rebozo. Among his drug smuggling credentials, Hallowell had worked with Chiang Kai-shek's intelligence chief, General Tai Lee, and had set up the CIA's drug smuggling air force, CAT, later Air America, as well as the Bangkok trading company Sea Supply, which provided cover for CIA officers advising the drug smuggling Thai border police. Functioning in a similar capacity in Panama was the ubiquitous World Commerce Corporation, the, quote, commercially oriented espionage net, unquote, formed by ardent Republican William Donovan and British spy master William Stevenson. In Honduras, Richard Greenlee, a member of Donovan's law firm and a former OSS officer in Bangkok, set up Vanguard Services in 1962 as a front for yet another batch of CIA-financed drug-related anti-Castro operations. There were dozens of CIA proprietary companies operating worldwide in similar fashion, and Anslinger in 1964 alluded to the power of this international cabal of gangsters and spies, which he referred to when he referred to, quote, higher authorities, unquote. Subverting a grand jury that had been convened in Miami to probe the financial affairs of a dozen top mobsters. I think I better read that again. There were dozens of CIA proprietary companies operating worldwide in similar fashion, and Anslinger in 1964 alluded to the power of this interlocking cabal of gangsters and spies when he referred to, quote, higher authorities, unquote, meaning the CIA or Hoover or both, subverting a grand jury that had been convened in Miami to probe the financial affairs of dozens of top mobsters. The excuse was that, quote, delicate investigations conducted by another government agency were underway, unquote, but Anslinger added angrily, quote, this was, quote, a dodge to call us off, and it succeeded, unquote. All of which brings us back to Meyer Lansky, the ultimate sleeping partner, whose drug money laundering enterprises stretched from Beirut to Las Vegas to the Bahamas, where, following the loss of his concessions in Cuba, he reestablished his gambling business with, among others, Louis A. Chesler and Wallace Groves. A Canadian millionaire and former rum runner, Chesler made a fortune in Florida land deals, then moved to Freeport and formed the Grand Bahama Development Company in 1964 with Wallace Groves. With the help of Hallowell, Donovan, and other CIA assets, mountains of Thai, nationalist, Chinese, and Vietnamese drug money were allegedly invested in Castle Bank and Florida real estate deals through Chesler's General Development Company. Groves had fronted for Lansky since 1951 when he sold valuable Key Biscayne property to Elena Santiago Aleman, mother of Santo Traficante's Cuban business partner, Jose Aleman. Eventually, the CIA hired Groves, Tex McCrary, Lansky's public relations consultant, whom George White had visited in Mexico in 1954, and Michael McClaney, manager of Lansky's Miami Beach Dinner Club, to suborn the top governing officials in the Bahamas, the tropical paradise that quickly became a major and luxurious transit point for Latin American drug smugglers. Meanwhile, Lansky's financial aide, John Pullman, incorporated the Bank of World Commerce in the Bahamas to handle the skim from several Las Vegas casinos. Pullman then merged his Atlas Bank, in some, quote, shadowy way, with Intrabank in Beirut. Formed by Palestinian Youssef Beidas and financed by several Arab nations under the direction of a Saudi Arabian arms trader, Intrabank owned the Casino du Liban in Beirut. This world-famous casino was managed by Lansky's drug-smuggling Corsican contact, Marcel Francisci. Like the banks cited above, Intrabank's Bahamian branch laundered mafia gambling and drug money with the full knowledge of the CIA. Despite the FBI's spotlight on Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky was the linchpin in the intelligence aspect of international drug smuggling that fascinated Hank Manfredi. Charlie Siragusa watched him closely, and he knew that Lansky sent Joseph F. Nesline and Charles Tureen around the world in 1962 to set up nightclubs and arrange drug deals. FBI agents followed Nesline, a hitman from Ohio, who ran a sexual blackmail ring in Washington, to a meeting in Germany with Davyad Dargai, an Iranian with a background in drug smuggling. FBI agents also followed Tureen, a mob killer in the Genovese family, to Bermuda. And yet, despite their surveillance, neither Lansky, Turina, nor Nesline would ever be convicted on drug charges. Quote, Lansky was a chameleon who compartmentalized his operations, bought political protection, and established fronts, George Gaffney explains. Not even the McClellan Committee and Department of Justice under Bobby Kennedy could get to him. Tom Tripodi is blunter. Quote, Siragusa was neutralized, he says, with regard to the CIA's and FBI's $1 million men, among them Meyer Lansky, and their seething hatred of the Kennedy administration. Here's one example of how this animosity was inspired. JFK wanted to expel Air America, the CIA's drug-smuggling proprietary airline, from Laos. I never knew that. Did you know that? I never knew that. And in 1962, in another attempt to curb the CIA's drug-smuggling activities in East Asia, Bobby indicted Sea Supply manager Willis Byrd, the original OSS liaison officer to General Tai Lee, for having bribed a U.S. official in Laos. The president also fired Ultra General Edwin Walker for attempting to indoctrinate U.S. troops on behalf of his Christian crusade. These were dangerous moves, but not as perilous as Kennedy's plans to desegregate the South and eliminate the oil depletion allowances that enriched Texas oil men, like Hoover's patron, Clint Murchison. the emerging Bush dynasty and right-wing zealot H.L. Hunt, and allowed them to seize control of oil reserves in the Middle East and the Far East. So Kennedy's enemies ensured that Byrd prosecution was blocked and that Air America kept its contract in Laos and continued to fly drugs. Meanwhile, General Walker, the far-right American Security Council, including General Lansdale and Air America Chairman Admiral Felix Stump, and the Texas Ultras started plotting their coup d'etat in Dallas. Such was the new frontier that the FBN's Wolf Pack entered as the Kennedy brothers burst upon the scene. It was a wild country populated by an angry FBI director, CIA assassins, and drug smugglers. And starting in March 1962 with the creation in the Pentagon of the Special Assistant for Counterinsurgency and Special Activities, that's right, SACSA, members of the U.S. Army Special Forces assigned to the CIA to monitor the drug trade in areas under communist control, quote unquote. In view of these developments, the new frontier was an inhospitable place for the FBN, which continued its descent into knavish spookery and internecine warfare. And that concludes Chapter 17, The Strength of the Wolf. Well, it's a great way to lead into the creation of SACSA in February and March of 1962. And I've done a series of SACSA Mindfields recently. If you'll go to the one that is the first of, I think, 6 or 7 of them, it picks up the story from there beautifully and introduces General Krulak. Thanks a lot for being with me, and a lot of those names that just came up are going to be in the newly released Kennedy papers. I think putting them in perspective the way Doug Valentine has done is a great service, and so I hope you agree. Thank you very much. I will see you guys tomorrow. Bye-bye.